Dear God, we thank you that, as was sung, we delight when we find out that everything is related to everything else. Help us see that and feel that as we reflect now. Amen. So, Dan and Laura, you couldn't have sung anything better before this sermon, which begins, "If you're like me, you are alert for signs of spring." And Bunny said that too when she said that we all need something to cheer us regularly. In the fall, we marvel at the color of leaves, how they turn, but botanists will tell us that the color that's revealed in autumn leaves is really there all through the entire growing season. The natural color of the leaf is disguised spring and summer by the action of chlorophyll, which causes the leaves to appear green. When the action of the chlorophyll eventually declines, the real color of the leaf is revealed. The real colors are revealed when the green goes away. Something like that happens in the Transfiguration of Jesus. The children told us those colors. It's the festival we're celebrating today. And at least it's a botanical equivalent of the theology behind the biblical story. Tradition tells us that Jesus' disciples saw him as he really was in the Transfiguration. For the first time, they saw his true colors. A veil was removed, and they were terrified by seeing his essential holy aspect. And here's the irony of it. Jesus' disciples had been getting a glimpse of this every day, but they hadn't fully processed it. Watching him operate, they've seen his uncanny ability to love and accept everyone on their own terms, right? It's so very striking. It's as if no one has ever seen anything to equal it in a human being before. Could he be sent from God, they wonder. It's his essential goodness that transfixes them, I think, which is disarming because he never, demands their attention. The gospel writer Mark says that just walking among them, he filled everyone with awe. He never, assumes power, never says, "Look at me," like an emperor or a king would. His power is not about might. His is totally a moral power. Could he be the true human being, the best of us, they wonder, the not emperor? That's what they're thinking as he walks in their presence. The Apostle Paul understood this well. He describes what the gospel writers point to in Jesus' transfiguration as well or better than anyone. It's found in his letter to the Philippians, written very late in his life. He has a very high understanding of the incarnation of Jesus. So he uses poetic language to describe it. He says, though he, Jesus, was in the form of God, he did not consider being equal with God something to exploit. But he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, becoming a human being, mortal. Finding himself in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God highly honored him and gave him a name above all names. This is what the Christ part of Jesus is supposed to be: a self-emptying, a humbling, a willingness to identify with a slave, the lowest of the low on earth. God honors him, consequently, for that. according to Paul. So, before I continue unpacking this holy moment, this transfiguration, let me offer this aside about the implications of what Jesus' power and his giving up of his power is and is not. Most Friday evenings, I catch the analysis offered by David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart on the PBS NewsHour. I don't have the heart to follow everything that's coming down from Washington exhaustively these days, but I find this weekly capsule from the NewsHour something I can at least digest, and I bet a lot of you would say the same. Anyway, 2 nights ago, I was struck dumb by the way the more conservative of the two journalists, David Brooks, whose political hero is Ronald Reagan, remember, summed up the meeting of the president, vice president, and Ukraine president Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office on Friday. What David Brooks showed us was just how totally opposite our current nation's leadership is, morally speaking, from that of Jesus as revealed in Paul's understanding in the letter to the Philippians. Here's what David Brooks said. All my life, I've had a certain idea of being an American, that we're a flawed country, but we're fundamentally a force for good in the world. That we defeated the Soviet Union, we defeated fascism, we did the Marshall Plan, we did PEPFAR to help people in Africa, and we make mistakes, Iraq, Vietnam, but they're usually mistakes out of stupidity, naivete, and arrogance. They're not because we were ill-intentioned. What I have seen over the last 6 weeks is the United States behaving vilely to our friends in Canada and Mexico, vilely to our friends in Europe. And today was the bottom of the barrel, vilely to a man, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, who is defending Western values at a great personal risk to himself and his countrymen. Donald Trump believes in one thing. He believes that might makes right. And in that, he agrees with Vladimir Putin that they are birds of a feather. And he and Vladimir Putin together are trying to create a world that's safe for gangsters, where ruthless people can thrive. And we saw the product of that effort today in the Oval Office. I first started thinking, this is David Brooks, am I feeling grief? Am I feeling shock? Like I'm in a hallucination? But I just think shame. Moral shame. It's a moral injury to see the country you love behave in this way. And so yesterday, the leaders of every free nation in the world did their best to reach out to Ukraine and support. And at the same time, every one of them backed away from us. So that the only friends we have now are in nations ruled by despots and gangsters, to use David's term. Russia and what? Hungary? And those friends, Russia, Hungary, they're laughing at us behind our backs. Who could ever have imagined? So, back to Jesus' holy moment, which, as I said, opening, we need to look at. This story comes to us just before the season of Lent every year. A couple of years ago, I spoke about the idea of thin places in reference to this text. If that's a familiar term for you, you might remember that the Irish revel in such moments. They like to imagine spirits who are said to appear to those attentive enough to be looking for them. These are places that exist beyond geography and also beyond time itself. Ancient peoples saw high places like mountaintops as locations where the standard rules of flat-footed living do not pertain anymore, and everything is just up for grabs. I'm talking about places where the eternal and the temporal are believed to sometimes meet. In the book of Genesis, Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, has a dream where he sees angels coming up and going down a ladder, joining heaven and earth, and he wakes in terror and wonder and awe. And he says, "How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven." As I say, ancient people took for granted that such thin places exist, thin meaning close to the holy. But our contemporaries sometimes have similar experiences, maybe even some of us here as well. Biblical interpreter Tom Long tells the following story about waking to such fleeting wonder. He says, "One day when my daughter was a little girl, she was dancing playfully in our living room. I was on the couch trying to read the newspaper, but her whirling motion captured my attention. I watched her spin, her arms spread wide and her hair tossing as she twirled across the room. Suddenly, the way her mouth was fixed, the manner in which her hair fell across her cheeks, and the play of sunlight through the curtains on her face created an unusual effect. For one instant, she looked not 5 years old, but 25. There was a single fixed frame in her motion in which I saw her, not as a child, but as the grown-up woman she would become. And then she turned, the light changed, her face broke into a grin, and she was a child again. But I had seen what I had seen, and there was no escaping it. It was a wonderful moment, and a frightening one as well. I had seen what I had seen, and there was no escaping it." So why is Jesus revealed in his full glory here at this point in his ministry? Well, shortly before this moment in Luke's gospel, Peter has a revelation and answers Jesus' question, "Who do you say that I am?" with the following words, "You are God's Messiah." You'd think such language, such a revelation might mark the final confirmation of who Jesus is. That no holy moment that followed could surprise Peter. But that turns out not to be the case. Peter, according to Luke, is flabbergasted by the story of Jesus turning a holy white during his transfiguration. He doesn't have the language or theology to process it. For Peter, it was a moment that transcended his confession. That confession, "You're the Messiah," marked a moment of, theological pronouncement and clarity maybe, but theology means little compared to an actual encounter with what is holy. There are no words to express what happens in those moments. Parenthetically, the next two sermons will be on what's spiritual as opposed to what's theological. Reflecting on this, Peter could have said, like Tom Long, "I had seen what I had seen, and there was no escaping it." I can honestly say that I have a sense of that feeling. It came for me 25 years ago when I visited Jerusalem for the first and only time. I had visited lots of holy places in the early days of that trip. Before we got to Jerusalem, our tour bus had taken us to Nazareth, Bethlehem, and the Mount of Transfiguration. And while I was impressed with those sights, nothing particularly moved me in any of them. But on this particular day, when we arrived in Jerusalem, we visited the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And I will tell you that nothing in my life before had prepared me for what happened inside me at that ancient spot. I have no idea what actually transpired. But when we came to that place inside the church where the huge greenish solid rock the ancient Romans used for crucifixion was standing right there inside the church, I was suddenly filled with a kind of awe and fear that I'd never known before or since. Nothing I've experienced compares with the sustained waves of whatever it was that came over me and wouldn't leave me until I finally departed the building. I cannot account for it, nor can I even describe it. I can only say that I had experienced what I had experienced, and there was no escaping it. And I can tell you further that when I sink into purely secular thinking and lose track of the spiritual, all I have to do is remember that day and recall a little bit of the holy fear I experienced that transported me. Well, I wonder if the gospel writer Luke is trying to say to us that the frightening encounter that Peter, James, and John have on the Mount of Transfiguration is meant to have a similar effect. I wonder if Luke understands it as a gift meant to get us through, the next hard patch we might face as those disciples accompanied Jesus to Jerusalem and have to go through what they have to go through with him watching Jesus in his passion. Maybe this bit of terrifying wonder is a special grace. Well, in closing, let me tell you about one such experience that a late friend of mine from Michigan had once. Her name was Diet Eamon. She lived to be 99. Born in The Hague, Netherlands in 1920, she and her fiancé, Hein Seitzma, began hiding Jews from Nazis in 1940, right after the Nazis occupied Holland. I know this not only because she co-wrote a book I read about her experiences, but also because the church I served in Ashland twice hosted her for a week when I was their pastor. We brought her in to tell her story to us, but also so she could tell it to our local school children. That kind of truth-telling about history is absolutely necessary. I mean, sad to say, 20% of Americans say they aren't sure the Holocaust even happened. But this is not why I'm telling you this story this morning. I'm telling you this because Diet once had a truly holy vision. She told me that she and her fiancé, Hein Seitzma, had been working in the resistance. She said, had we known that the war was going to last 6 years, not 6 months, we probably wouldn't have gotten involved the way we did. What they did was hide Jews with Dutch families in rural areas. Then they found that wasn't enough. They had to forge ration cards and IDs for these people, just so they could survive. It was full-time work and harrowing, too. They even helped a number of downed Allied pilots get back to England. Well, one day she and her fiancé, Hein, met for a picnic lunch somewhere out in the country. They rode their bikes separately to the spot in order to meet. It was 1944. During lunch, Diet said she felt a premonition come over her. She heard something deep within her say, "You better take a good look at him. You better take a good look at him." So she followed the voice and did just that. It startled Hein, who asked what in the world she was doing. "I'm just looking at you," she said. And after their lunch, without knowing it, they rode out of each other's lives Both were arrested soon after. Hein did not survive the war. He died in Dachau. And after the war, Diet married someone, but the marriage was not a happy one. Hein Seitzma had been the love of her life. "You better take a good look at him," said the voice. "This is my beloved Son," said the voice of God on the Mount of Transfiguration. "Listen to him. Listen. Look. Pay attention." To all of us, sometime in life, or maybe even several times, comes the admonition, look, listen, be aware. Take a good, long look at those kids, those grandchildren. There is something in those holy moments that is sustaining, that is fleeting, that is beautiful and holy and life-giving. Jesus, remember, once said, "Behold the lilies." Such awareness is meant to get us through times like these. They have to.